Lauren, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited for this. It'll be great. Give us a brief introduction. How you got into this whole world of mental toughness and mental fitness.
Yeah, man, see, it started probably without even really knowing it when I was young and in sports. I grew up playing soccer my whole life. And there was something about sports that kind of brought something out in me and kind of pushed me to be better. And it was actually my senior year in college. I received my fifth concussion.
Oh my gosh.
I come back from my fourth concussion just the year before. And it took me out for about 6 months. And I was really excited because it's my senior year, and every senior wants to do something big their senior year. And so third game in, when I received my fifth concussion, I knew it the moment it happened. I knew that feeling, and my neurologist came up to me and was pretty much like, Lauren, if you want to remember your name at 40, I'd suggest you stop playing.
Wow.
Because I can't guarantee the next concussion won't be permanent. So it was, even though I think all athletes, they rebel and they're like, no, I can do this. Let's keep going. I knew that at that point it had, it was more important to remember my name than it was to be remembered as a soccer player. And so that was a difficult decision, but I think it kind of led me to this, to sports psychology, because I ended up taking an elective course, and I was the only person to sign up, and I fell in love with it. And so I took the course in sports psychology, and I just started to realize as I was studying, oh my gosh, I relate to this. And I think the reason why is because I was the athlete that needed it. I was the athlete that constantly got in my own way and limited myself. And so I went on and I got my master's degree and just completely fell in love with the subject.
Wow, that's so cool. I really admire that you played soccer, because I also played soccer, but on a much smaller scale in high school. And I was not very good, but I was also fascinated by what makes good players good and what makes the great ones great, right? There's such a big gap. And then in terms of in the college level, everybody's great, but there's a few that they separate them. They're exceptional.
Yeah.
So it's probably those mental things that separate them.
Yeah. And I think that's what I started to realize, is that a lot of the things that held me back were actually controllable.
Mm-hmm.
And I had power over them. And there were things on the mindset that because I didn't have these skills, I didn't have these coping mechanisms or these tools in my toolbox per se, that I wasn't able, they became limiting factors because of that. And so when I realized, oh, wait a second, this is what I should have done in this situation. This is how I should have responded in this situation. And the fact that mental toughness doesn't make you invincible, it just makes you adaptable.
Yes.
The best athletes, the best individuals, the best, writers, surgeons, you name it. It's not that they don't experience discomfort or difficult times. It's that they can adapt to them quicker and better than most.
Absolutely. So today we're going to deconstruct 7 mentally tough people and kind of figure out what mental tools that they use to be mentally tough. Because as you'll find out, a lot of them didn't start out mentally tough. So the first one is David Goggins. He grew up living in fear. He faced incessant bullying, racism, emotional and physical abuse. And he says the most important conversation you'll ever have is the conversation you have with yourself. And my conversation was absolutely horrifying. I thought I was dumb. I thought I was a nobody. I thought I was a loser. And so then in his early 20s, he had asthma, he had a learning disability, a stutter, and crushingly low self-esteem. He was earning less than $1,000 a month spraying for cockroaches, until one day he came home with a 42-ounce shake from Steak and Shake, sat down in front of the TV, and stumbled upon a documentary of the US Navy SEALs that changed the entire trajectory of his life. He went on to do, at the time he weighed nearly 300 pounds. And then he went through 3 Navy SEAL Hell Weeks, more than 50 endurance races, and he holds the Guinness World Record of the most pull-ups in 24 hours. So he basically, Goggins believes that you have to do one thing every day that absolutely sucks, something that you absolutely do not want to do, because that creates that mental friction for you to get more resilient, right? Like what do you think about David Goggins and his kind of tools to get through life?
Well, by far, and people ask me this all the time. They're like, "Okay, Lauren, what's a good book to read?" Without a doubt, on my top 5 is "Can't Hurt Me" by David Goggins. Highly, 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 highly recommend it. Why? Because it's relatable. It's a lot of the things he talks about are things that we've all been through, and so I think the first skill that kind of comes to mind that you mentioned is self-talk. The way that you talk to yourself has an impact on how you show up. I mean,
have you ever caught yourself doing something wrong and you hear how you talk to yourself and you're like, oh my God.
Heck yes. And I think the first step to self-talk is awareness. We can't change anything if we're not first aware that we do it in the first place. And so sometimes what I'll do with athletes and stuff is we'll chat about, the things that we tell ourselves, and they'll be saying it out loud and they're like, oh my God, I can't believe I say that. Like, I didn't even realize it. Or I'll bring it up to them like, oh, did you hear yourself say this in the game? They're like, oh my God, I did. So a lot of times it's become so automatic. Our response to making mistakes, to doing things wrong, or, whatever that is, it can become so automatic that we're not even aware that we do it. A lot of it is kind of subconscious.
Lauren, isn't it true that a lot of times our self-talk, so let's say I do something and I'm like, God, Paulina, you're so stupid. Do you think that some of that comes from your parents and what they told you as kids? So that voice might not even be your voice.
It can be, yes. And I actually have a really good story about this. I was working with a player a while ago, and for whatever reason, whenever I'd go and talk to him, he really struggled. Like, he would just give me one word answers, like really, really short. And I thought it was odd. So and I had a pretty good relationship, or at least I thought I did. So I was like, man, I wonder if I said something. So I kind of confronted it and I said, hey, do you mind if I ask you a question? I said, have I said something to offend you? Maybe that I wasn't aware of, because it seems like every time I try to have a conversation with you, it's one word answers. I just want to make sure I haven't upset you and wasn't. And he said, no, that's not it. Huh. We explored it a little deeper. And he said, I'm not a very good speaker. And I said, where did you hear that? And we kind of dug deep and we figured out the first time he ever heard that was in first or second grade when he was asked to read out loud. And, he said, and I struggled. And my teacher told me, you're not a very good speaker. And I said, and who's telling you that now? And he said, Bryant.
That's so crazy.
And so I think one of the things that David Goggins and my athlete, what we talked about is this identity. Okay? Our beliefs plus actions equal identity. So my athlete, his belief was that he's not a good speaker. And every time he acted within that belief, he supported this identity that I'm not good at speaking. And so I think with David Goggins, every time he grabbed a shake at Shake Shack, or every time he, ate something horrible, every time he would give up because it got difficult, he reinforced the identity of I'm not enough.
Yeah.
So I think that the way to change it is we can decide, we can rework that equation. Who we want to become, our identity plus our actions, it reinforces our belief.
Yeah.
And if you want to become, let's say somebody that is a good speaker, what actions can you adopt that can enhance, that belief? Every time you do something, we improve our belief in ourselves, whether it's a good or a bad belief. And so if you continue to get up and you speak and you prove, I guess, and you cast that vote, which James Clear says a lot,
yes.
Of who you want to be, then suddenly our belief starts to catch up with that.
And you mentioned something important here, which is about identity. Goggins says that he believes he was built, not born. And he has this famous saying, but he consciously, intentionally created a separate identity that separated him from the bullying, the fear, the abuse. And he explains why he sometimes refers to himself in the third person. If you notice in his posts and in the way he talks, he says, I had to create Goggins because David Goggins was a weak kid. So I created Goggins. I wanted to be proud of who I was. So can you speak a little bit to that, like self-distancing a little bit to see yourself from a slight distance that gives you an advantage of, hey, I'm not that person anymore?
Yes. So there's a lot of science behind this. When we distance ourselves from our emotions and who we think we are, who we thought we were, or what we do is we create space and we're able to manage it better. So a lot of the times when we say like, oh, I'm stupid, I am this, I am that, we're identifying with that moment, with being stupid, with not being enough. When we say, when we back up and we look at a third person perspective, like that, like Lauren, that decision wasn't your best decision. Suddenly we're backing up and we're removing the emotion and we're stating the facts. And so a lot of times when we do a third person party, it's actually a really good thing. And so a lot of times you'll notice, either professional athletes like David Goggins, or we're looking at, even performers, there's like a performer self. And we can actually create two different versions of ourselves. And so what I do is you can put a name to them. And there's science behind this. It's called name it to tame it. Dan Siegel talks about this. So when we name our emotions, we put a label on who we're being or how we're being or how something showed up, and we give a label to it, it actually sends soothing neurotransmitters to the emotional centers of our brain. And so what that does is it unlocks our ability to use our frontal lobe, which is our more irrational thinking brain, more rational thinking brain, so that we can make better quality decisions. And so one of the things you can do is label who you are when you're not showing up as your best self. And for him, it was David Goggins. Like how I show up. This guy is I show up weak. My body language sucks. I talk to myself poorly, and actually write it out. Who are you when you show up as this person? And then Goggins. This is how I show up when I'm my best. When I show up my best self, this is what I look like. And I talk to myself. I don't listen to myself. I encourage myself. I remind myself that I'm really damn good at what I do. And so when you then write out your best self, and then don't be afraid to label it. When you feel like you're showing up as David Goggins, like, thanks for showing up. We don't need you anymore. Goggins is back. And when you do that, we start to access the best version of ourselves without attaching to that poor version, if we even slip into that from time to time.
That's so fascinating. And we've seen it with Beyonce and Sasha Fierce. She created an identity so she could perform. She was shy and introverted, but Sasha Fierce was fierce, right? Then there's Kobe Bryant. He showed up as the Black Mamba. A lot of people use this, in everyday people like us, like we don't realize that we have access to that too.
Absolutely. And so for anybody listening, I encourage you to create those two. I do it with my athletes all the time. And when we create those two, it actually feels like we have a choice. Again, we're not identifying with who we are in that very moment, but that we have a choice to be who we want to be. And when we distance ourselves, we give ourselves the ability to choose. When we're so close to it and we're identifying with it, we feel like it's just who we are, and we have no control.
Absolutely. Wow, that's such a great one. Another one that I wanted to talk to you about is David Goggins talks about this 40% rule. He says that the 40% rule is the reason why even the most, mentally tough people hit a wall at mile 16 during a marathon, but they're still able to finish. So the rule is simple. When your mind is telling you that you're done, that you're exhausted, that you can't go any further, you're only actually 40% done. And he compares it to a car. And he says a lot of cars have governors on them, let's say 91 miles an hour. It may only go 91 miles an hour because the governor stops it from going 130. We do the same thing to our brain. When we get uncomfortable, our brain gives us a way out, usually quitting or taking the easier route. So how do you make sure that you can get past that governor of your 40%?
Our brains are wired for this. Okay. It's nobody's fault. It's our default setting. Your brain is wired to protect you. That's it. Now, when it's life or death, that's great. That wiring is very useful. But most of the time, our brain will show up to protect us when we don't need protecting. And so we have to be, one, present to that when it happens. Like, okay, thanks. Thank you. I don't need you right now. And number two, we have to choose our response, because our threshold for discomfort is much like your threshold for lifting weights. If you go in and you haven't, trained lifting weights, you're probably not going to be able to do a 300-pound deadlift. If you go in every day and you train a little bit of discomfort, we widen that gap. So what Goggins says, and he says that you do something that sucks every day, he's widening his threshold for discomfort. You can't expect to go from not lifting to 300 pounds, but to build on that, we can go from maybe your threshold of discomfort right now is at, I don't know, 65 pounds. And so 70 would be just above that threshold for discomfort. So as we kind of do that, we can build that threshold, all the while knowing that your brain at some point is going to try and stop you. And so one of the things that we do in terms of goal setting that a lot of people, I think, forget to do is when your goals meet reality, they're going to need adjusting. So we need to not only plan for what we want, but what to do when things we don't want show up. There's internal and external factors. Internal factors meaning your own self-talk, your own limitations. Like, I'm not good enough. Your brain kicking in and going, let's turn around. Okay, that's an internal limiter. And then deciding, if this happens, then I'm going to remind myself of this.
Yeah.
Maybe a contingency plan, and our brain loves it. Because what we're doing is we're linking a situation to a behavior that we want to follow. And so I don't know, I'm sure, again, you've heard, if anybody has read or listened to David Goggins, if he's in the gym, he reminds himself when he feels limited, he reminds himself back in a time when he was most uncomfortable, when he was in buds training. And he goes, who's going to carry the boats? And he yells it, who's going to carry the boats? And so when his mind starts to become a limiting factor, he then reminds himself who's going to carry the boats, because he knows that that's what he needs to hear to get him to that next level.
That's so fascinating. One thing I remember reading, I read this profile on Mike Posner when he walked across America. And there was one part in there where he talks about how he basically, his body, he was tired, he was exhausted, but the mantra he kept saying in his mind was, just get to Kansas, just get to Kansas. Like, if you get to Kansas, you're so close. But what happened was he got to Kansas and then his entire body just started falling apart. And he was like, wait, what's happening? And it's because you've kind of set a limit in your brain. Like, once we get to Kansas, all good, like you can relax. And I think that we do that a lot in real life without realizing it. We set markers for ourselves where if you want to set a goal, you should set a stretch goal so that your brain kind of subconsciously, once I get there, I'll be done, but not before that. Does that make sense?
Yes. No, absolutely. It's like these expectations that our brain is ready to meet. Okay, I can meet that. All right, I've come to terms with that. But it sounds like maybe he failed to do or we weren't prepared for is we get there, then we'll focus on the next.
Right.
Then we'll go to the next, because I love chopping it down to its really simple form and digestible form. It's actually, I love to run. I'm not incredible at it, but I've ran a couple half marathons and that's how I do it. Is I'm like, 3 miles for me is no problem. So I just take the race 3 miles at a time. And so what we could do is maybe it's, instead of going, we'll go to Kansas, it's let's take 2 states at a time. Let's take, this much at a time. And so what I do is I chop it down. And so maybe it is to Kansas. Okay. Then after Kansas, then I'm going to focus on here. And then I'm going to focus here.
See, that's interesting. When I was training for a half I knew that if I had told my brain we're only going to run 3 miles today, it was calibrated to 3 miles. And I was starting to get tired at mile 2.7. But when I told my brain today we're running 9, for some reason, 3 went by, 4 went by. It's just because I had focused on such a far goal. I knew there was no stopping before then. So I was more mentally prepared. Instead of when I just say, today we're running 3, I was like, oh my God, we're at 2.7, 2.8. You know what I mean? When your brain knows it's coming.
Yes, no, exactly. And again, it's meeting that expectation and that threshold. And so you're right. We can do ourselves a really big disservice if we say I'm just going to run 2. Well, again, your brain goes, okay, let's do it.
Right.
To get to 1.7 and all of that, we don't ourselves, to think further, but chop it down. Yeah, we can definitely put ourselves in that mode. And that's how powerful our brain is that our brain is so powerful. The things that you tell it, it listens. And so that's why I think self-talk, bringing it all back to that first thing that he said, self-talk is so important. And then the strategy in which you do that's important also.
Yes. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about with Goggins is he has something called the accountability mirror. And I think it's really cool because anybody can do this, right? So when he first decided to become a Navy SEAL, he looked at his reflection in the mirror. He said to himself, you're fat, you're lazy, and you're a liar. What are you going to do about it? To most people, that sounds really harsh, but he says that he needed to face the insecurities that he had in order to start to overcome them. So he created something called the accountability mirror, and he pasted little sticky notes all around the outside of the mirror, outlining the practical steps he needed to take to achieve his goals. So they would say things like, go 1 day without lying for external validation, or go on a 2-mile run. So if you're not happy with your reflection, Goggins recommends asking yourself, what am I going to do today to change what I see in the mirror? Why is that so powerful?
Because you can't lie to yourself. You are the one person you can't lie to and get away with it. I guess you can try, but deep down, you know what the truth is. And the same way we earn trust with others by doing the things we say we're going to do, we can earn trust with ourselves by keeping those promises and doing the things we tell ourselves we're going to do. And I think it was Conor McGregor that said this. He said, doubt is removed by action. And so every time you act, we remove doubt. We close that gap between, of doubt. And every time we say we're going to do something and we don't, we open up that gap. And so it leads to things protecting our ego by lying, by just saying, oh, no, that's fine. Or validating why or why not we did it. And so I would say that right there is, that's really important. And I could not agree more. I think that when you talk to yourself in the mirror, you can't lie.
Yeah.
It really opens up some of these blind spots or things that maybe we don't like to admit to ourselves. And yeah, it can hurt, but it's so necessary to get to that next level.
Absolutely. And it gives you like self-validation when you look in the mirror and you're like, yes, I went 1 day without lying to protect somebody else's feelings or whatever it may be. And that builds confidence little by little.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, so the next person we have is Courtney Dauwalter. She, in 2017, dominated headlines after she won the Moab 240, which is a 240.3 mile foot race. God, that pale. My 3 miles pales in comparison. Through some of Utah's most challenging terrain. It took her 58 hours, and she beat the second place finisher by more than 10 hours. During her races, Courtney's fascinating because she's gone through things like hallucination, blindness, sleep deprivation, vomiting. She had a bleeding head injury once, but she always continues. And I don't know if you watched this, Lauren, but I watched this Joe Rogan interview with her, and he kept asking her questions to try to be like, okay, but like, isn't that crazy? And she'd be like, no, I had no choice. I had to continue. And then he was interviewed about that interview, and he was like, I couldn't, like, Courtney's demon is a subtle one. It's a quiet one. She's not out and like loud about it, but like it's in there to make her do all these things. What do you think about somebody like Courtney?
Oh my gosh. First of all, it's incredible. The level of discipline that it takes to do something like that, and not only physically, but mentally to stick to that. It's pretty incredible. And you only do that through repetition. And again, keeping that promise that you made to yourself, because I'll tell you right now, you're not always going to feel like it. And so we can't rely on feelings. Feelings they're a data point. They're not final. They're not facts. They're just a data point, and how we choose to interpret those feelings says a lot about how we show up. And so perspective is so powerful. And so in terms of not having a choice and saying, this is what I said I was going to do, and I'm going to do it, you can't do that without extreme discipline and being committed to your process. And I think it's absolutely incredible.
And I think that she has learned how to master the difference between pain and suffering. She's decoupled them from one another, right? She can experience pain, but she's in charge of like, am I going to suffer? And people look at her and they're like, oh my God, a bleeding head injury. Like, why don't you stop? But to her, that's in her mind, that's not even an option. She just sees it, like you said, as a data point. Is this, will I die? No, I'm going to keep going. One of the things that she talks about is embracing the pain cave. And she talks about pain as an actual place that you go to. And when she was cross-country skiing in high school, their coach taught her that the pain cave is not as scary as it sounded. And the reason it's helpful to actually personify pain as an actual place is that it serves as a reminder that you're in control of when you enter it, and you're equally in control as when you leave it. And she says, it's not a place I'm scared to enter. It's a place I'm excited to find the entrance to. What does that tell you?
Oh my gosh. It's pretty badass. And like, there's a couple of things that I love about this, because I think a lot of times when we feel pain, our default is to default to this kind of victim mentality of, for me, this is the reason why I can't continue. This is the reason why I have to stop. This is the reason why I couldn't finish the race. Where when you take ownership and accountability of it, it no longer has power over you. And I always say that, if you don't have a problem, if your problem is solvable. If your problem is solvable, you don't have a problem, you have a choice. And so I think that a lot of times we look at these things that happen to us as problems we don't have a choice, that are not solvable by ourselves. But really, a lot of the times it is with our perspective. And so, if you think that something's horrible, or you think that somebody is out to get you, or you think that, you're in a really bad position, then that's your brain's going to listen to that and go, oh yeah, we're going to protect you. We're not going to do that. But if you say, like, wait a second, hold on, no. This hurts, but I can do things that hurt. Like, this is difficult, but I can do things that are difficult. And you can remind yourself that I've been here before and I've gotten through it before. That what it does is it gives you kind of that thing that you need to hear to keep going. And this, John Gordon actually talks about this. He was working with, he was an extreme triathlete. I might botch this a little bit, but I'll get to the main story. Is that he asked this guy how he did it, and how he ran a triathlon and then 48 hours ran another one.
Yep.
Or I think it was an Ironman. And he said, it was easy. I learned not to listen to myself, but to talk to myself. Because when I listened to myself, I heard all the negativity. I heard all the reasons why I shouldn't, why I should stop, why I can't. But when I talked to myself, I was able to feed myself with the things I needed to hear to finish the race.
Ooh.
And so I think that to some degree, that's what she was doing. She wasn't listening to all the reasons why she shouldn't, that this pain is too much for her to bear. Instead, she talked to herself and she's like, let's bring it on. Let's go.
And she's like, we've been here before, and you came out.
Yes. And she approached it with a challenge mindset versus a threat mindset. So she's playing from a place of power, or performing from a place of power rather than a place of fear.
God, I love that. And do you think that the more you do something like that, the more you can change the governor in your brain to, like, maybe her governor isn't at 40%, maybe it's at 20, and then it was 10, and then it was 5. Like, you just kind of remove that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said before, mental toughness makes you adaptable. And so it gives you the flexibility that you need in those moments when you need it most.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think the other thing that she says, what you alluded to earlier, is she says that she stays motivated in these super long races with a carrot goal. So in one ultra race, her goal was to complete 200 miles in 48 hours, but she had a really rough race, and another competitor passed her for first place in the very last stretch. So she needed to find another reason to continue pushing her body. So her new goal became, if you're not going to get first place, then try to finish under the 50-hour mark. And so it became a new carrot to dangle, is how she puts it. So it's the same with everyday life, right? Like, if you fall short of a goal, you can find another carrot that will keep you motivated and get you closer to your next attempt.
Oh, absolutely. Because we have to be flexible. Just because you could practice, you could practice perfectly. You could prepare perfectly. You can do all the mentally stuff, all the mental toughness work to get yourself prepared, but it doesn't guarantee success.
Yep.
The best know that. And so you have to be flexible, be committed to that outcome that you really want, but flexible in your approach. And so if you get to the point where it's like, oh, well, they tell you like, so-and-so actually took the first place spot, okay, well then what is the next thing, the next best thing that is going to motivate me? And I think that's important. And Marcus Luttrell from Survivor, he talks about this with the way that he survived at war. And he was, if you've seen the movie or you read the book, he was the one that survived this horrific firefight. And what he did is he broke his legs, he bit his tongue in half, had broken ribs, like horrible concussion. And what he did was he would draw a line. He'd reach his arm out, draw a line, and he goes, my only goal is to get my feet to cross that line. And he would crawl. Wow. He ended up crawling over 7 miles to his safety. But he was like, I would have never fathomed 7 miles in my mind. No way could I have taken that on. And so when we can really lower that down to something,
chunk it down
to those small pieces. And so whether that is, okay, first, this is what I'm going to do. And then I'm going to dangle a smaller carrot in other ways. It may not be just applied to adjusting our end goal, but also adjusting our approach.
Exactly. So maybe the answer is, what your end goal is, 240 miles, but to break down that 240 miles with little things to look forward to and to motivate you to get there. And I think, so to wrap this up, she says she believes that people can endure far more than they think is currently possible. And she says our ability to bounce back is part of what's so cool. You can endure a lot if you set your mind to it and push through. Wow, it's crazy. We're resilient beings.
Absolutely agree. And I love it because it's so true. It's overriding that default. And it's like when you get a phone, you have, all the apps on it. But the difference is you can't download a new way of thinking. The way that we download a new way of thinking is through repetition. And so it's committing to, when you feel that discomfort, not running from it, but leaning into it. Because as we do that, we rewire our brain to seek it, not run from it.
I love that. Okay, our next person is Tara Westover. She was 17 years old when she first set foot in a classroom. She was born to survivalist Mormon parents in the mountains of Idaho, and she grew up isolated from mainstream society. Her father had a severe mistrust of the government to the point where he forbade the family from visiting hospitals or attending school. Why is Tara mentally tough?
Lots of reasons. Lots of reasons. I think having to overcome something that's really difficult. I think when you look at anybody that's mentally tough, typically there's something attached to it in terms of they've had to go through something difficult. Mm-hmm. You can't grow and be comfortable at the same time.
Right.
Having to overcome the things that she did, I think helps to breed the mental toughness that she has. And it's pretty incredible.
Yeah. And I found it fascinating. If you haven't read the book Educated, amazing memoir, but what I found fascinating is the ability for her to motivate herself to reach this goal that, her family didn't even believe in, which was school. She taught herself algebra, like all these things that you and I take for granted, but she had to kind of change her mindset into, I know that I've never been exposed to this, but I am willing to learn. And I think a big part of mental toughness is the willingness to learn new things. One thing she says that I find fascinating, and she says, don't mistake your reality as the only truth. So the world is not binary. Obviously, it's messy, it's complex, confusing. But when she was growing up, she considered her father's opinion as the truth. And in her family, it was understood and accepted that men have power and influence, women are submissive, and higher education is a waste of time. But after she started going to school, she realized that version of the world is not the only version. And I think it takes so much strength and courage to start to question your own family's beliefs and opinions and start to empathize with other people's journeys. What does it take to because when you grow up, your family's truth is the only truth. What kind of person does it take to be able to be like, oh my God, there's so much else out there, and I'm willing to kind of discard some of this to adopt something else?
I think it's more common than we think. I see it so much, actually, when I was working with the Yankees. I saw it a ton. And I think the important thing to know is that when people, like, it's not anyone else's journey to understand. It's yours. And when people tell you, people that love you, tell you like, oh, you shouldn't do this. It's not because they don't love you. It's because they do. And to them, they're trying to protect you. They don't know any different. But I think it was, I can't remember. I don't know. I'm blanking on the name. I can see him. Can't remember.
It's okay.
It'll come up later, but this is not my quote, but I love it. And he said, how can somebody that can't do what I do, tell me what I can't do?
Right.
What gives you that right to say what I can do when you can't even do what I can?
Yeah.
And so I think that sometimes we give way more power to the opinions of others. And it's not to say that, like, you know, there are people that just suck out there that are just being jerks, but then there are people that love us. And I just think that they're coming from a different perspective. It's not that they don't trust you, but maybe it's just because they don't understand it the way that you do. And again, it's not their journey to understand, it's yours. And that's okay. I mean, to me, I look at, you know, every baseball player, professional athlete I've worked with, or CEO, like somebody has told them, you shouldn't do this, or you can't do this. And I just think that, you know, at first people are going to, you know, tell you, like, they're telling you out of their own fear. I think it's kind of like a reflection of them.
Completely.
But the second you start doing what you want to do and you start doing it well, they're going to tell everybody how they met you.
That is so true. And it's hard to think, like, it's hard to imagine being somebody or doing something when you haven't had that role model in your life that's actually done it. So it's up to you. But I also think there's great, like, power and opportunity in that. Like, there's a curiosity. Can I do it? Will I do it? The other thing I want to ask you about is, this actually reminds me, I think a lot of athletes maybe struggle with this, but when Tara so she went off to college, she created this new identity for herself. And then when she went home, she felt herself falling right back into the same identity she had when she lived with her parents, which was a fearful and insecure 16-year-old, you know, as we all have once been. But, you know, I think a lot of athletes, when they go and they train and they're around other successful people, they have one identity, but then they, like, go home and it's easy to fall back into the unhealthy patterns you had when you were in high school, for example. Have you seen that?
Oh my gosh, yes. And it's, you know what, this is exactly what describes, okay, if you've ever been to one of those, like, seminars or conferences,
Yes,
where it's like a self-help or, like, let's transform, where you're at and you're there and you are so jazzed and you cannot wait. The reason for that is because the environment supports it. And the environment is that invisible hand that shapes us. And which is why it's so important to pay attention to who you're surrounding yourself with.
Wow.
When you go home, you go back to that environment that you came from. Or when you go home, you go back to the environment that maybe that is against, like, does not support those same things that you want. Those people don't reflect those same viewpoints that you have. And it's not to say that everybody should agree with you, but your environment is so important. And so there's a really great analogy about fountains and drains. And we all have drains in our lives. There are those people that when they call, you look at your phone and you're like, oh gosh, I do not want to answer. You're like, oh, like, we all have them if we're being honest with ourselves.
Yes.
And then there's those people, when you get off the phone, you are better as a result of being on the phone with them.
Yes.
And so the question is, who are the fountains and who are the drains in your life?
That's such a good question to ask yourself.
Yes, because when we are around drains, it's really easy to second guess. It's really easy to tell ourselves that we can't. It's really easy to feel unsupported, and your environment won't support the things that you want. And here's the thing, when you're going after something so big, your foundation matters. The size of the building that is built is determined by the quality of its foundation. If you want a 2-story building, the quality of the foundation, it doesn't mean it's not good, but it doesn't have to be big.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be as strong. But if you're out to build a freaking skyscraper, it's got to be strong. And I tell my athletes and people I'm not interested in building 2-story houses. I'm interested in building skyscrapers. And with that comes those little things that are like those attention to detail. And that's with those fountains and those drains. And so what you were saying about Tara is that, when she was out doing her thing, her environment that she created for herself supported the things that she wanted. And when she came home, she was reminded, and she was in an environment that didn't.
And I love this. I literally practice it in my everyday life. Whenever I think it was James Clear who said, find a group or create an environment where the desired behavior is the normal behavior, because you can spend so much time and energy with the wrong group, like you said. And when for example, when I wanted to quit my job at Fortune to do a newsletter and make it a business, there weren't a ton of examples. But I had two options. I could spend all my time convincing my family and friends why this was a good idea and why it's not insane and all this stuff. Or I could spend it joining groups where that behavior was already normal. Other newsletter writers who had somehow turned their newsletters into businesses. And the difference is, instead of spending my time and energy convincing, I was spending my time and energy iterating and brainstorming and asking questions. And that wasn't even a question, is this crazy? It was a reality for them. So I mean, that's such a good question. Like, who am I spending my time with? And is it making me more resilient and a better human being?
Well, and I think the important piece to this is, a lot of people think that means like, oh, I need to cut people out of my life. That doesn't always mean that, but it doesn't always mean cutting people out. I mean, sometimes it might, but in other times it might just mean changing your proximity. Not being, you don't need to be on a call with them once a week. You don't need to go to lunch with them multiple times a week. You don't need to, spend a ton of time, texting them on the phone. It's just maybe not cutting them out, but changing your proximity to them is the answer.
I love that. Absolutely. I also heard one time somebody said, before, if you want to kind of change your behavior and all this stuff, instead of thinking you should add new people into your life, like take a look and be like, who is so draining that it literally is really, really, don't think about like growing your group. Like maybe think about curating your circle in a good way. Okay. So Anthony Ray Hinton, God, this story is just heartbreaking. One of the best books I've ever read is The Sun Does Shine by Anthony Ray Hinton. So in 1985, he was arrested and wrongfully charged with 2 counts of capital murder in Alabama. He knew it was a case of mistaken identity, but he naively believed that, you could prove your innocence because that was the truth. But he was a poor Black man in the South at a time when, it was really hard to prove your innocence. And he was sentenced to death by electrocution. He maintained his innocence through the entire duration of the 30 years he served on death row, which makes him one of the longest serving death row prisoners in Alabama history. And in his time on death row, he watched 54 men walk past his cell to be executed. Another 22 took their own lives. And he says, my cell was 30 feet away from the chamber and I could smell the burning flesh. Yet he managed to maintain hope and befriend those society had given up on over the course of 30 years on death row. I mean, what do you make of this?
It's almost like you're almost speechless when you hear something like that. Because you can only imagine. And your imagination can't even come close to probably the way he was feeling. In those moments, the feeling of injustice, the feeling of, this, I shouldn't even be here. What would my life be if it wasn't? And I think that one of the things that makes me admire somebody like him so much is his ability to focus on what he can control.
Absolutely.
I think that, it seems so simple, right? Let's focus on what we control and let go of the things that we can't. But right here, this is when it matters the most. And most people do it. They're wanting to sit in the injustice and all that's true, but we can't control that, which is we couldn't at the time. And so to me, it's just it's absolutely. I mean, I just have so much admiration.
And I thought about myself and how, like, I think you always think, oh my God, an injustice like that, I would hope the truth comes to light. But every year you learn like you're getting farther and farther from that. So somebody once asked him, how did you maintain your sanity, right? Like, I mean, that's a recipe for psychological turmoil. And he said that he figured out a technique that was able to get him out of his current reality by daydreaming and visualizing a better life. So while in his cell, he traveled the world, he married Halle Berry, he had tea with Queen Elizabeth, and he won Wimbledon, all in his mind. And he says, I never used my mind for garbage. I used it to cope through some lonely days. He even started a book club for fellow inmates who also wanted to experience the power of visualization. So I think it's fascinating that, especially if you already have like an active imagination, it can work for you in negative ways. You can visualize how things go wrong, how you fail, all this stuff. But if you can figure out how to use it to create a better reality, it could be so powerful.
Oh my gosh, yes, especially because there's no limits in your vision. Absolutely no limits. And I like to call it kind of, the time traveling. If we time travel to the future, what would you want to create? And the cool thing about visualization is our brain doesn't know the difference between imagination.
That's fascinating to me.
And so it's the same when you're watching a movie. You're not actually a part of the movie. This isn't actually happening to you, but we have an emotional response to it. And it's because your brain doesn't know the difference between imagination and action. And so we can still fire those same neurotransmitters in our brain when we visualize as if we were experiencing. Wow. And so a lot of the times, there's another famous story of James Nesbitt who did this, and he visualized playing a round of golf every day on his favorite golf course. And he was a prisoner of war, and he was there for 7 years and never once stepped foot obviously got to play. He was just by himself in his cell. And when he got out, despite his horrible physical shape, he went out and played, and he took, I think it was like 20 strokes off of his golf game. Wow. Just visualizing and imagining doing it. And so I think that, it goes to show that we can, our mind is so powerful. And in those moments right there, Anthony is a perfect example of this, that people that are able to build these mental skills and use them, when we're in the mental toughness is easy when things are going well. It's when things aren't going well that truly show, what your mental toughness level is. And it just shows that somebody like Anthony was so had the mental skills and willing to use it in the most difficult time. And it just shows that, that you can use these things and they work. And especially, every person's different, but visualization is one that we can connect our emotions. And we can feel emotions as we do if we're actually experiencing it.
Because isn't it true that if you watch something or you visualize, you can trigger your emotions, which then triggers your memory? So again, it's like you feel your brain thinks you're doing it, but you're not actually doing it. And in terms of visualization, I've heard this a lot with athletes, but how important is it to get like super specific in your visualization? Like, should you be looking down at the golf club and the golf ball? I don't know much about golf, so but how specific should you be in like what you visualize?
Well, the more specific you can become, the better, because it mimics reality better when we're more specific. And so you can start with like kind of your 5 senses, so things that you see, hear, feel, touch, taste, and get really specific on those things. And it's not always easy for everybody. So it's fine to start small and start with maybe a couple senses, but as you continue to improve on that is to grow in terms of senses. And so the more specific you are, the more real it becomes, and the stronger those connections that we feel in our brain, and those emotions that we can connect to in our brain. And when we're speaking to those and we can feel those emotions, what we're doing is we are speaking directly to the part of our brain that makes decisions.
Yes. And go ahead.
No, that's just that's the emotional centers of our brain. And so I think that's really powerful.
Absolutely. And the other, I think, big key to mental toughness is the ability to find the good in the really awful. And I wrote about him, how it's hard to imagine you'd be able to forgive those who abused the system and sentenced you to death for 30 years. But he sees it differently. He says, I've never had an apology, but I forgave those involved in my conviction long before I left prison. I didn't forgive them so they can sleep well at night. I did it so I can. And research actually shows that people who are good at framing negative life events in positive ways have typically better mental mental health. And even though, he went through 30 years of mental and physical anguish, he still manages to find peace, gratitude, and humor in his experience. He says, they took my 30s, my 40s, and my 50s, but what they couldn't take was my joy. I couldn't do a thing about the years, but I could control my joy. Oh, like how?
I love it. I could not, I can't imagine to that degree. It's like I've never even come close to experiencing anything he's experienced. But I think that there's something that we forget. There's something that can never be taken away from us, but it's often forgotten, that we have a choice.
Yeah, that's what he talks about.
Yeah. And if you look back there, I'm sure there's a million things he could tell you about his misery, and that were horrible, and that were unjust, and that were terrible. But when you can look back and you can choose to find the good and the bad, your experience of it changes. And for anybody else, it's for you. And how you experience that and what you take from that, can really have an impact. It's, again, if he decided to exist in the misery of that, he may still find himself miserable. So if you want to be miserable, focus on all the things that make you miserable. Focus on all the things that are negative. Focus on all the things that are unjust. But if you want to find happiness, if you want to find enjoyment, especially in things that we can't change, then focus on those things that came from it. I'm sure there was a lot of good things that came from it, despite it being so horrible. And I think each one of us can look at things that were horrible to us, but something good that came from it, the lesson that we learned, or something that we benefited from, if we're willing to look at it. And I do think that that's a choice. It's not an easy choice, but it is a choice, and it does change how we experience that and how we look back on our past.
I think that framing things a certain way is so powerful. And I learned this because my family moved from Bulgaria to the South, to Atlanta, Georgia. Then I lived in New York. I have all these different frames of, I've seen really, really rich people with seemingly no problems in their life be absolutely miserable. And I've seen really, really poor people be really, really happy. So how do you define that? It's how they look at it. Anthony and I were recently talking about this, about how sometimes society frames things in a certain way. For example, if you're a soldier and you go to a war zone and you get blown up and you lose your limbs, for example, which is a horrible thing to happen to you. You come back to the United States, everyone's like, oh, this is so sad. You're so unlucky. This is horrible for you. How are you going to live the rest of your life? And you could frame it as, but like, I am not unlucky. I'm lucky that I survived. A lot of the other guys didn't, so it's like, you can choose how to look at an event. And if you want to be miserable, you could literally find so many things to be upset about.
Oh my gosh, I agree. And there was actually a great story I heard from a friend of mine. And he was saying that he was working with a soldier, and it was a Wounded Warriors program.
Yes.
And he went up there, and this guy was in a horrible, I think he got hit by an IED and lost both of his legs and his right arm. And he went up to him and he's like, how are you so positive? And he goes, well, thank God I'm left-handed. And
again, and it's the humor too.
Yes, it's finding that it can always be worse. There can always be something worse. And when you have that perspective, it doesn't take over you. Again, you give yourself the power back. And I think that it's less about what happened. The lesson is never what knocks you down. What you choose to do in response to getting knocked down. That's always the lesson. And so I think that with somebody like that, it's easy that the normal, which our brain always picks up on patterns, it looks for patterns. So the pattern we would typically hear is, oh yeah, this sucks. I wish I could walk, I lost my ability to run. But the pattern breaking is, yeah, but I still write left-handed.
Right.
So I just think that there's, again, it's a choice that we make. And it's a pretty dang powerful one in how we choose to live.
Wow, that's so good. All right. So next on our list is Emily Harrington. Let's talk about fear. She recently became the first woman to free climb El Capitan's notoriously difficult Golden Gate route in under 24 hours. She attempted it last year, but it ended in disaster because she fell 50 feet, hit her head on a ledge, and suffered a concussion. And she says it's definitely a mental struggle coming over that hurdle, coming back into this year and trying again. But she says people talk about conquering your fears. They talk about beating your fears, making your fears go away. I don't ever really feel that. I feel I feel fear quite frequently, honestly. I work through it by just accepting it and trying to understand why it's there and then taking steps to move forward. How do you, like, I hear people say all the time, you have to accept the fear, but how do you accept something that makes you scared?
Well, I think that there's this in science, it shows that, our thoughts, the things that we feel, right? The things that we think affect the way that we feel. And then that affects our physiology, and that affects how we respond to a situation, or our behavior, or our actions. But what we fail to realize is it's not a one-way street. That's not the only way it works. Because you can think one way, you can feel one way, and you can act entirely independently.
That's so mind-boggling.
Your feelings and actions don't have to match to coexist. So you can feel fear and do it anyway. You can feel confident, but look confident. You can feel like, oh, I'm not ready, and be ready. And so I think where we fall is when we take actions how we feel, and we let that dictate our actions. And so I think, by overriding, instead of like allowing our feelings to be the final word, is taking the actions that we know is right, regardless of how we feel. And so that's what it kind of sounds like that she's doing, is like, I'm not ignoring the fact that I feel fearful. It's not ignoring the pressure. It's not ignoring those negative feelings or feelings that make us uncomfortable, but it's accepting them and choosing to act anyway.
It's kind of like, okay, so I am really scared of skiing because I go into immediate, I'll break my leg, I'll do it, whatever. And I recently went, and I am telling you, Lauren, like it wasn't that steep, but I was at the top and I was looking down and I was like, oh my God, like the visual, everything, just like I was firing on all cylinders. I still tried, but the fear was so severe. And I was in my head, I was like, I'm not going to die. Even if I fall, even if whatever, even if I break something, I'm not going to die. But it was so absurd and like physical. It was crazy. And I think it's very much, I think the visual, like what we see really informs everything else. For example, bungee jumping, it is safe in most cases, but when you see that, your instinct is like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And you can do it anyway, even though you're scared. It's kind of similar, right?
Well, and it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. So if we look at it this way, again, going back to perspective, okay, this challenge versus threat mindset. When we view something as a threat, our body responds.
Okay.
So what it does is it actually constricts our blood vessels, trying to get all of our blood vessels to our major organs. Our lungs kind of constrict. Our heart rate variability goes down. It restricts, oxygenated blood to our brain, making it tougher to make, good rational decisions. And when we shift our mindset from not ignoring the fear, but looking at it as this is a challenge. Like, I got this. Like, this is difficult, but I can do this. What it does is it shifts our body's response, and our blood vessels actually dilate, our lungs expand, we get more oxygenated blood to our brain, allowing ourselves for clearer, more effective thinking, and our heart rate variability goes up. By simply changing the response, if you look at the difference between excited and pressure, a lot of them are similar physiological symptoms. The only difference is the way we perceive those symptoms. So when we look at it as a good thing, our brain actually associates that and it responds different. So it prepares us for the moment instead. So it doesn't mean to ignore the fear, to say that it's not there, or, lie to yourself, but it's looking at it and shifting our perspective that, okay, this is difficult, but it's a challenge. Like, I got this, number one. And then number two, choosing to act and doing the right things, focusing on just a couple things that is right, despite our feelings.
I love that. And one thing that Emily does is she actually uses mantras, and she tells herself, be vulnerable, accept failure, and embrace fear over and over and over again. And I think it's really interesting because she says that you should actually go find what makes you uncomfortable and what scares you, because often that's what passion is. You don't realize it, but like passion is, oh my God, I'm so scared. But it's also, I want to figure out how to solve this puzzle, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's a data point. Feelings aren't facts. They're data points. And oftentimes what it is, it's alerting you. And you're not going to feel, there's different kinds of fear, right? There's a fear of, getting hurt or injured. And then there's a fear of not being good enough or failing. And you're not going to feel that kind of fear if you don't care about something. So really, it's a good indication that this is something you care about, and that, that's okay. I mean, I think it's great, because I do think if to some degree you don't feel failure. And I know some athletes say this, they're like, I would feel weird if I didn't feel some sort of, I'm sorry, not failure, but fear of failure. Because that kind of shows me that, like, okay, I'm ready. And so one way to view this too is to list how you feel when you're under pressure, you're in that fearful state. And then instead of looking at it as a bad thing, like, oh my gosh, all these signs show me I'm not ready to perform, is looking at it as a checklist. So for me, when I'm in front of a really big group of people, I still get nervous and I still want that approval. And so what I do is I take my checklist is like, okay, my palms are sweaty, check. My heart rate goes up, check. I'm feeling shaky, check. Okay. This means this is my body telling me I'm ready. And so I shifted it from, this is my body telling me, oh no, this is not good, to this is my body helping me prepare for the moment. Because that shot of adrenaline can actually help us focus and give us more energy in times where maybe we would step back from it.
And I like how you made it almost like clinical, like it's a checklist. It's very logical. It's not emotion driven. So it gives you some emotional sobriety in the moment to be like, I'm going through my checklist. Like it's a very, I like that. It's a quantitative, like logical driven approach.
Exactly. And again, giving yourself some space from the emotional ties of it.
Yes. Sara Blakely, she is fascinating because she is the founder of Spanx. But growing up, she actually wanted to be a trial attorney, and then she bombed the LSAT. Then after college, she auditioned to be Goofy at Disney World, but she was too short to wear the costume. And then after she was an Epcot ride greeter at Disney, she returned home and moved in with her mom and started selling fax machines. But she is super interesting because she's the type of person that reframes failure as a challenge, and she actually sees failure as not trying hard enough. If she didn't fail at something, she's like, I didn't try hard enough. So what do you think is like the key to her success?
Oh my gosh, I love that she talks about this, right? With being at the dinner table with her dad.
Yes.
And her dad telling her, what'd you fail at today? And that was his question. What'd you fail at today? I love it because I think that, number one, failure is a lot of times something that we fear because we fear rejection. I mean, it's human nature.
Yep.
To rejection. We want to be accepted. But it reframes it, because if you think about like a weightlifter, okay, when we hit like a, personal best, when we hit a PR in weightlifting, you won't know how far you can go until you risk failure. So when you lift, so you find your PR, you lift to failure. You lift, you can't lift it anymore. And so my question a lot of times is, how do you know how far you can go unless you lift to failure? Unless you work to failure. And
totally.
How will you know how far you can go if you don't risk losing it to some degree? And I just think that, my husband and I, we actually challenge ourselves in the gym. We actually had like a little competition.
That's actually exactly what I picture you and your husband doing.
This whole competition where we said, who goes to failure? Like when we were in the gym, whoever goes to failure more in each class, like wins. And
that's
so
cool.
we'll be lifting like to failure a lot of times.
How do you define failure? Like until you're shaking, you just can't do it? Or how is it? How do you define it?
Successfully, I guess. And I think that that's another way is number one, the way that you see failure makes a big difference. Because the way you define it means something. I don't see failure. For me, I don't define failure as an outcome. I define it as not trying, very similar to Sarah. Because I can control trying. I can't always control the outcome. And so a poor outcome doesn't always mean that I'm not enough. It may mean that I need to do something different. It may mean I need to shift something. So I think failure gives us a lot of good feedback on what we can improve. And so I just think that failure is not final. Failure is just a step on the way to improving. And that's professional, right? Professionals are just amateurs who repeatedly tried, failed, learned, and improved more than somebody else. That's it. And so that's exactly what, like, to me, I think failure is just a stepping stone along the way.
And that's the other thing. Like for me, like, let's say you could objectively from the outside look at my brief high school career as a soccer player and go, you failed at that. Like you didn't play in college, all these data points. Or I could say, did I fail or did I just not try hard enough? Right. If I had actually tried and like gone to every practice and listened to the coach and like done all the things, could I have improved and gotten better? Probably. Or did I fail or did I give up? So I think a lot of times the things that you give up on, some people might frame as failure, but to you, it shouldn't be viewed as that. And I think that Sara Blakely talks about, like you said, her dad would ask them at dinner, like, what did you fail at today? And she says, if I didn't have something to share, my dad would actually be disappointed. So he wanted like a juicy, like failure. and she says, instead of failure becoming an outcome, it simply became about not trying. And that truly is the only failure, to not try.
Yes. And I could not agree more, because again, failure is not final. Not trying is. That's what's final. And I was having a discussion with another athlete earlier this morning, and it was about failure. And I asked him, I said, how do you define success?
I love that question.
And he was kind of like, I mean, I guess it's like the outcome, right? And I said, well, is it true that you can do everything right and still get a bad outcome?
Oh my God. Yes.
And it's like, is it also true that you can do everything wrong and get a good outcome? It's like, yeah, I have done that before. So I said, good results are not always the result of good things. Same as bad results are not always the result of bad things. And so what's more important is the quality of what you do.
Mm-hmm.
When you put in quality reps, it equals quality results over time. And so I think it's more important not just to look at the result of what you do, but how you do what you do.
Mm-hmm.
And does that then lead to this? Because you might be doing everything right. You might go, well, I got unlucky, or I just didn't, that guy just beat me. Or, hey, this is what I could do a little bit different, but it doesn't necessarily mean you failed. So that's another piece is, how do you define success? And I rather have like people I work with focus on the quality of what they do, not simply the result of it.
Absolutely. Another thing that I think in mental toughness is underrated is humor. In the hardest, most difficult situations, like we saw it with Ray Hinton, we saw it with Sara Blakely, which I will tell you right now. But using humor to diffuse a really tough, heavy situation can actually, we've all been in a situation where everybody's really, really down, and then somebody says something funny, and it just immediately lightens the mood. Sara actually says her husband is Jesse Itzler, and he is a complete goofball. But she says when choosing a life partner, the quality that has withstood the test of time in their marriage is a good sense of humor. And she says life can be heavy, and having someone who can lighten the mood or make you laugh is one of the most important things. So she says that when she and her husband get into a really, really heated argument, he extends his hand and they slow dance. So it just like immediately breaks that awful, like nasty situation, and it lightens the mood. Have you found this works?
Yes, no, absolutely. It's so funny. let me see here. I was young. I was in high school. Yeah, I was in high school. I was playing club soccer, and I took it super seriously.
Yeah.
I was very.
God, Lauren, I would have wanted you on my team. I don't think you would have wanted me on your team.
I probably took it too serious. I could have used a little bit, somebody to like bring me down a little bit. And I remember I would get in my own head all the time. And so we were driving to this tournament, and it was a college showcase tournament. Mm-hmm. My mom's best friend, she's like my second mom. She was there. And my mom, while she likes watching me play sports, she wasn't big into sports herself, but her best friend is. So like I connected very well with her friend. And we got there, and she's like, I have something for you. And I was like, okay. And I look in my bag, and she had snuck in these like little baby cleats, and she printed out a million photos of my head and cut them out.
That's so funny.
Cleats, and she goes, dump it out. I was like, you're joking. She says, no, dump it out. And we were laughing so hard. I was like, how long did this take you? And she's like, longer than I care to admit. And it just broke the ice. And I'm like, you're right. What is the point of this? Like, you are enough. You are good. Just go be you. If you do what you know how to do, you're going to get looks, you're going to get offers, and it just really lightens the mood. So I totally agree, because sometimes we can take ourselves too seriously, and there's something to say for just simplifying it all and just realizing and almost zooming out, because in this moment when we're so into it, it's hard to see like 10 feet past us, 10 feet in front of us. So when we joke and we laugh, it kind of brings us back down to reality and like, hold on, this is not to say this isn't important, but this isn't the only thing that is.
Right. Right. It's not life or death. Like it will be okay. I think we're very similar in that. I think we're people who put a ton of pressure on ourselves. Like other people may have expectations, but like the ones that we have for ourselves are probably 10 times that. And God, who was it? Somebody I was reading recently, how they would, it, what did she say? Now I'm forgetting who it was, but basically like when you were younger, when she was younger, and she would punish herself way more than like her parents would or her teachers or whatever. She would go in her room and just be like, I can't believe I messed this up. And like all this pressure and self-flagellation, when in reality, like nothing is truly life or death. You can probably find some small thing of humor in it.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. And here's the thing, beating up on yourself is not going to get you one step closer to your goals. Okay?
Yep.
It's just not. It doesn't mean that you can't be upset. It doesn't mean that you can't be sad, but create a boundary. So a lot of times what we do is we create a boundary with, with people that I work with, is what is your boundary? And, with the golfer, for instance, you hit a bad tee shot. Okay. Well, you have till your next shot, till you put your club back in your bag, you can be angry. But when you put your club back in your bag, it's over. And so some of them, they hold on to their club until they get to the next shot. And I'm like, that's fine. But once you put that back in, like you are done. And so what we do is we kind of create this boundary around our emotions. And I think of it like fire. Fire can be really good. It helps us cook, turns on candles, all this stuff keeps us warm. But a fire without boundaries can become a wildfire.
Oh,
burn down buildings. It can destroy neighborhoods. It can destroy, animals' homes. And so I talk to people a lot about putting boundaries around our emotions. And fire's not bad, but be the bonfire, not the wildfire. Create a boundary that has like a limit to it. And you're still human. You're still going to feel it. But when is enough? And when is that boundary going to hit?
Exactly. Again, like the Courtney Dauwalter, you can choose how much you suffer, basically.
Exactly.
Awesome. Our last mentally tough candidate here is Kobe Bryant. He was an 18-time NBA All-Star who had a 20-year career with the LA Lakers. He died in a helicopter crash last year. And I mean, I didn't know too much about Kobe, to be honest, until recently. And then I dove into his life and I was like, oh my gosh, he went from the most insecure, scared person to somebody who was so resilient. And I think he could have only done that because he started as someone with so little confidence and self-worth. But he was best known for his obsessive pursuit of precision and excellence, which he dubbed the Mamba mentality. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Kobe is, he's somebody that I often think about when I think about mental toughness. He's somebody I talk about often. He's one of the greatest examples of being mentally tough and being consistent and being committed. And I think one of the things about Mamba mentality that I love the most is he never gave himself an excuse. He held himself to this crazy standard, but he was committed to it. And he didn't let out, there's going to be factors that constantly try and take your attention away from what you want to do, right?
Yes.
And he just wasn't, like, they weren't allowed in.
Because he was obsessed.
Yes, he was obsessed and he was just passionate and it made him happy. And he built his support system to support that structure that he was building. And so it wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was also building around him in a way that helped support the structure and the system that he had created. And so to me, easily one of the most mentally tough people in sports.
And like David Goggins and like Beyonce, he also created an alter ego to kind of summon his confidence. And he created this alter ego at the lowest point in his career, where he would go out on the court and people would boo Kobe. But he thought, okay, but Black Mamba, like now it's time. And he says that at a time when people were chanting Kobe sucks while he was playing, Bryant said that using an alter ego gave him emotional distance from his real self. I was able to switch my mind to something else. When I make the mental switch to the Black Mamba, I know it's go time. I wonder why your mind does that though. Like, obviously it knows the difference. Obviously it knows you're not the Black Mamba. So why does it act in accordance to that?
I think that it gives you permission.
Mm.
I think a lot of times, it's, I think of it a lot in terms of military. Like my brother, he was a special operations Marine and in MARSOC. And, when you think about it, there's this level of arrogance you kind of have to be good.
Yes.
And, we don't really want somebody, fighting for our country. That's just, I'm just humble and I just want
you don't want me fighting for
same with like people in baseball. You don't want humble Henry on the mound, right? Mm-hmm. We want somebody that's almost to some degree arrogant and has such a confidence and belief in themselves that they truly believe anybody that steps up to the plate is going back to the dugout. And the point that I'm trying to make is that neither one, being humble and having a little bit of arrogance or confidence, neither one is better than the other. What matters is the timing. So I think that, Kobe and Mamba mentality, both of them were him. But there was a time in competition when he could turn it on and he'd go, this is appropriate for this situation. Because it's not, again, for my brother, it wasn't appropriate to take the mentality he had in war and to come home and be the same way in a civilian life. It's not the same, which is really hard, by the way, for a lot of people in the military to adjust and make that adjustment. And so, which is why I think defining two versions is really important, because I think it gives you permission to be one without having to be both.
I love
because otherwise you're like, wait, this is who I am, but wait, I'm like this sometimes and I'm not other times. And they can be really conflicting. You can be both. It just matters when. So I think he mastered the ability to be humble in certain areas. Like Kobe was just so humble in so many areas and would listen and would learn from other people. But when he was competing, he was going to beat you.
Yes.
So I think that there's a difference between those two. And it's important to know where you are in any given situation and when you should be one or the other.
That's cool, because there are athletes, right, who are super aggressive and super competitive when they're in the game, but in real life, they're not as aggressive and as competitive with their friends. Is that correct?
Yeah. And I'd say that they are aggressive and competitive. Think about like Tom Brady, for example. You can't play a card game against Tom Brady and he not be competitive. But I think it's different, when you're speaking to, just anybody. But I think when you bring competition into it, it's like one of the little tips and tricks for all mental coaches out there is when you can gamify anything into a competition with a team, like you've got their attention.
That's so cool.
So, but at the same time, when you think of Tom Brady and you would think about having a conversation with him, he's so humble when he talks. And that same with Kobe, and that same with somebody like Derek Jeter. When you sit down and talk to them, they're so humble, and you're like, wow, they're so humble here. And then you get them out there, and it's not that they don't show some humility out there too, but they bring something a little different.
Yes. And I actually think that the alter ego thing, for somebody who's very sensitive and takes things personally, it gives you an ability to be like, oh, wait, they're not insulting Paulina, they're insulting the Black Mamba or whatever, right? So it does allow you to have a little bit of that distance. The other thing that Kobe, I thought was interesting is that to him, the antidote to listlessness and kind of all this swimming in the unknown was drive and relentlessness. So he never believed in this idea of just go with the flow. Everything he did was super intentional. And so he said, instead of shying away from adversity, this is what he always said. I'm reflective only in the sense that I learn to move forward. I reflect with a purpose. So, I mean, that's because most people, you're either stuck somewhere in the past. You're either thinking when you were 16, you're either thinking when you were 5 and how unjust your parents were to you, or you could remember we only have forward now.
So another thing to add, another antidote to that is competence, which is
competence
alluding to is he would gain confidence and understanding around the unknown, around things that he wasn't aware of. And so when we can prepare for something, we can gain competence, we actually also gain confidence in terms of acting. I actually saw this this past weekend. I was talking to my mom and she was telling me about something she was really afraid of. And I said, okay, well, let's pretend that happens. Like, what's a worst case scenario?
Yeah.
What are you going to do? She was like, you know what's so weird? When I accept that might happen, I'm not scared of it anymore.
Huh.
She goes, it's like the anticipation of something that built up this nervousness, and it's like the anticipation of it. But when I look at it as if it did happen and I go, okay, what would I do if it did? You gain awareness and competence around it, and then you gain confidence to handle it. And so, there's a great Chris Hadfield. He was,
yes.
Yeah. So you know exactly what I'm about to talk about. He's an astronaut, and he wrote an incredible book, and he talks about this. And he said, I look at the worst case scenario. Like if a fire happens in space on the spaceship, he said, that's the worst thing that could happen. Why? Because if you can't contain it, there's nowhere to go. So he says, we go through all the scenarios of what could happen, what's the worst thing that could happen, and how we respond to it. And he goes, and when we do, now when it happens, we're not panicked about the what ifs of it. We are focused on the what nows. Mm-hmm. So I just think that that's kind of what you do when you're able to reflect on those circumstances.
Again, Chris Hadfield, on the idea of competence and confidence, he says that when you're young and you're first learning to ride a bike, the bike is really damn scary. You're like, oh my God, I could fall off, I could hit my head. And it's a really scary thing. And then as you get better and you start learning how to ride the bike, you realize that you're not scared anymore. But the bike itself did not change. It's just as scary and dangerous as it was when you first looked at it. But you have changed. You have become more competent. So you're not scared anymore. So I think if you start thinking about like that, like things and objects and situations aren't scary, it's you that gets scared. I think that's what he says. Things aren't inherently scary. People get scared. Then you can start to move from there. If you're competent, you won't get scared.
Oh my gosh. Yes. You just nailed that. It's so true. That's why when people say, how do I get over fear? I'm like, do it, lean into it, run towards it. Even if it's small and incremental at the time, just write down your biggest fears, the things that you're fearful of, but would be good for you if you overcame them, and circle one and start attacking it. Because
absolutely.
Times, like you said, it's not the object that changes, it's us. And so we can only change when we start to take action and lean into it.
I did that with public speaking. I was absolutely terrified, sweating, nervous, voice shaking, face getting red, like all of the things. And because I was aware that this is a skill I absolutely needed to have, and it would be good for me in my career going forward. And it was a fear that I wanted to overcome. Lauren, signed up for every single shitty panel I got invited to. And I was like, okay, I don't care. Yes, there are going to be people there, but it's okay if I make a mistake or I get embarrassed. I won't be embarrassed because I know it's a small group, whatever. And the more I practiced, the better I got as the crowd got to 200 people, 300 people. And again, it was because I put myself in situations that were scary, but they weren't detrimental if I said the wrong word or I didn't express myself properly, right? And so then get more and more competent.
Right. Rinse and repeat. Put in the
exactly. Awesome. Well, okay. So Lauren, if I'm sitting at home right now and I'm generally I have anxieties about things, I'm scared of some stuff, and I want to become more mentally resilient, what are 3 things you recommend I do right now that I can practically do to get more mentally tough?
Number 1 is start becoming aware of the things that are limiting you. I think, when you walk into a mall and you go to the map and it says you are here and you're like, okay, I want to go here. The knowledge of where you currently are is sometimes exactly what you need to get to where you need to go. So 3 questions I would ask yourself is, number 1, where are you currently? Number 2, where do you want to go? Secondly, a good question to audit kind of your current behaviors are, number 1, what do I need to stop doing? Number 2, what do I need to start doing? And number 3, what do I need to continue to do? And you don't need to take all of them on at once, but maybe one of those items, start working on. and start mastering. So number one, it's just the awareness of where you are. And that kind of can help us decide, okay, this is where I'm currently am, and this is where I want to go. Number two, grab a piece of paper, draw a circle in the middle, and in the center of that circle, write all the things you can control. And on the outside of that circle, write all the things you can't control. Let that serve as a visual reminder, because one of the things to go when we are when we're feeling overwhelmed is our sense of control. And so let this serve as a visual reminder, something you can come back to remind yourself, where is my effort being placed? Because when we give effort to things we can't control, our effort is wasted. When we give effort to the things we can, our effort is effective. Wow. And number three is create space between what is happening and your response. Okay? Or your immediate response is going to want to be an emotional one. And so in order to create space so that we can take some more time to make that response, is slowing down your breathing. You want to control yourself, start by controlling your breathing. And so take 1, 2, 3 deliberate breaths and slow yourself down. Give yourself a moment creating space between what's happening and your response to it. So those are 3 things that we can do just right now to help us kind of build a little bit more resilience.
I could not have put it better myself. So this is where we're going to end it. Thank you so much, Lauren. I really enjoyed this.
Oh, thank you so much. This is so much fun.